Hi, welcome to Shakespeare Month for May 2018, and I'm so excited to share with you that the play we're going to be looking at this month is Love's Labour's Lost. This is one of my favorites, one of the first ones that made me like Shakespeare, and although I think it's on one level a pretty simple plot-wise play, I've actually heard it said that it's the most complex Shakespeare play, so we'll see where you land on either side of those those attitudes. But like all of Shakespeare, there's so many layers. There's very surface layers, and then you can just keep going and drill down farther and farther and farther for more wisdom and more intricacies. So there's something on every level of value. And what I'd like to do is just go through the plot, and then I'll talk about the things that are interesting me about the play and the versions that I recommend, which I'll also link below in the description of the video. So, Love's Labour's Lost is a comedy, and it is about the King of Navarre, who decides to seclude himself with three of his courtiers for 3 years to gain wisdom, to learn. This is very much kind of satirizing all these male-only wisdom societies like the Rosicrucians and the Masons. I don't know about the Rosicrucians actually, but definitely the Masons, or any kind of just secluding yourself for study. So with his three companions, the King of Navarre says, we're going to seclude ourselves for 3 years. We will not see a woman for 3 years' time. We will fast once a week, like 1 day a week we'll fast completely, and then, have one meal a day for the rest of the days. So very strict. And Barone, who is the outstanding of the three courtiers, says, hang on a minute. Did I really sign up for this? That's ridiculous, we're going to break this oath. If we can't see women for 3 years, we'll break this oath immediately. But he has promised the king, so he ends up taking the pledge to seclude himself, sequester himself with the rest of them for this time. But, as it would happen, the Princess of France is already on her way on an embassy with her three ladies in waiting. So right away, they are poised to break this oath. And I should mention, for the sake of the logistics of this, that a woman is not to come within a mile of the court. So the Princess of France gets there. They meet her outside, out of the palace, and have some conversation about some land that he was going to sell her father, the King of France, which is going to have to get resolved. Not right then, but they're waiting on some papers, so the Princess of France is going to have to stay. But since they have the oath to not let a woman within a mile of the court, they are staying in a field or just outside the court. So that's not very gracious, not a very gracious way to start. And of course, the king and the princess like each other immediately, and the three men and the three ladies in waiting like each other immediately. So that's where we're set up. We also have some subplot characters. Of course, there's a fool. There is this ridiculous Spanish guy who's at court. And I'll just say this, from some of my light research, this is actually based on a real person who was the Secretary of State to the King of Spain, but he defected and went to England and was taken care of and friends with Anthony Bacon, Francis Bacon's brother, so he was well known among that circle. So, and then this, well, I'll get into more specifics of that later, but people watching this play would see this ridiculous character and know exactly who that was, because this guy he just had this really weird, over-flowery, not accurate way with language, and so I guess in Shakespeare's time, Bacon's time, people would actually like copy out his letters for entertainment to read them because it was just so ridiculous. So that's like another layer of humor to this character, but he's just a ridiculous, overblown language buffoon. He arrests the fool Custard with a woman, which is against the law because the king has proclaimed it. So the fool is sentenced to fast for a week, and Don Armado, the Spanish guy who arrested him, is in love with the girl that he was arrested with. So we see some of his ridiculous, flowery, wooing language towards this kind of country wench character. So that's them. Where this dovetails is Barone, the main courtier. He has co-starred the fool deliver a letter to the lady-in-waiting that he's in love with, Rosalind. And at the same time, Don Armado, he has the fool deliver a letter to the country wench, Jacquinetta. Of course, these letters get mixed up, which I'm sure by now you're waiting for this to happen, some kind of confusion. So it gets sorted out pretty quickly on the girls' end, but when we come back to all the men, we see them all lovesick. They're just, each one has written a sonnet to the lady they're in love with, hiding it from the other men because it's a breach of their oath. And there's a very funny scene where they all kind of are hiding and catching each other, pouring out their hearts and reading their sonnets. And Barone's almost gotten away with it, but then the letter comes back because it was given to the wrong person, and so then everyone finds out about everybody. They're all in the same position. So at this point, they realize that their oath was really dumb, and they renounce it and go to woo the women. They do this for some reason in disguise as Russians, but the women find out beforehand, and they are all in masks, so they switch around and make the men woo the wrong women. So they don't even notice, because the mask, is just there of who they think it is. They don't even notice that they're not talking to the girl they like. So then they come back and it all gets straightened out. The women make fun of them for that, and then things are kind of getting wrapped up when the princess gets word that her father, the king, has died. So now the party's over. She's got to go home and spend at least a year in mourning, I think is probably pretty traditional. So the women say, we were joking, and the men have said that their professions of love were true. So each of the women gives the men the man that's courting them a task. If you can do this for a year, that will, prove your love to me, and then, you'll have my heart. So the one that's the one that I'm just going to point out here is Barone's and Rosalind. They're the two wittiest characters, and she gives him a task to go to a hospital and to use his wit to make these, wretched, sick people happy. So that's a pretty big task to do that for a year. And then it's proving his love in action. So I'm going to talk about that in themes in a second. So that is basically the gist of it. It's, boys meet girls, attraction, confusion, matching wits, a quick departure, and a promise of reconciliation. So that is the plot in a nutshell. I hope that made sense. And this this has been really interesting for me to think about as I've been reading about the themes and watching a little and studying a little bit, because it seems like a kind of straightforward romantic comedy, But as Peter Dawkins, who's a Shakespeare scholar who is a Baconian, a Francis Bacon advocate for the author of the Shakespeare plays, and a very just very knowledgeable about all the mystical, symbolic side of Shakespeare, all the deep mysteries in Shakespeare. He's the one who says this is the most complex play because the men, they're seeking wisdom at the beginning, but the first thing they do is shut women out, and you can't do that. There is a rejection of the divine feminine, which is really, a fool's errand. And it's really interesting. I mean, that's pretty basic, but it's very interesting to me that it still persists. I think that there's a masculine misconception that women will impede the attainment of greater knowledge or wisdom, or even just accomplishing whatever work you want to do in the world. There's an attitude throughout history and throughout art and drama in history that women and love is something that is going to take you off the path of great knowledge and attainment. And what this play really shows or one of the things it shows is that you can't just shut that off, and that there's the male and female energy and the divine feminine and the divine masculine are both needed for great wisdom to be found and to be expressed. And the other thing that I hadn't thought about before is I'm going to come back to that later, actually. I want to talk about that separately. So let me just gather my thought here. So that's, at the beginning of a play when someone says, I'm not going to see a woman for 3 years and I'm just going to study, and all they end up doing in that time is pining for a woman instead of studying even, that's going to be trouble. And the women are much more on top of things in this play. But of course, it's a noble pursuit, and like I said, this was really satirizing all the masculine, the men-only institutions of the day. And even when I was reading about the historical context of this play, even Francis Bacon at Gray's Inn was the law, the inns at court for all the lawyers, and it was all men. So they're secluded from women, not really by choice, but just that's how it was. So he's got a lot of experience in this. And I want to talk briefly about the history of this play. I think it's interesting from historical context, especially if you like to think of Bacon as Shakespeare. So this is the first play that, when it was printed, had William Shakespeare's name attached to it. But it had most likely been performed about 5 years before it was ever mentioned, because it matches up with this thing called the Revels, which would take place around Christmas time from December even to March. And that's where you have Twelfth Night, which is part of the time of New Year's. And it's a time where things are really topsy-turvy. And there's someone who's called the Lord of Misrule, and there's just all this kind of craziness happening. There's plays and pageants, and what's interesting about this to me was that if you know that, there's a lot connecting this to Francis Bacon as Shakespeare, and just a lot of things that would have made sense to people at the time. So when the men come to the ladies in disguise, they're disguised as Russians, and the year that this was probably supposed to be in that Revels lineup, there was a pageant that Francis Bacon put on that was this play of these knights, and they were fictitiously coming back from some campaign in Russia. So there's a lot of references from what Francis Bacon actually wrote that was performed in the revels, and those things are referenced in this play that wasn't published till 5 years later or ever recorded as being performed. But there are a lot of references back and forth that I just thought was really interesting. I don't know if any of you guys think that's interesting, but I do. And it helps me to know sometimes where something came from historically, because then the people are real, and it's, it's an inside joke that if I was around, 400 years ago, would have been funny, just the same way as somebody making a joke about our current, celebrities or political leaders is, funny or topical to us now. And nobody will know what it is in 400 years, maybe. And especially when there's a character like we saw Falstaff, he was based on a real guy. This Spanish buffoon is based on a real guy. It just helps because maybe it's not so funny now as it was then, but they're really just making fun of a real person that they all knew. So these revels were performed, I believe, at the inns, the Gray's Inn, the Lawyer's Inn, where Francis Bacon was. So that would have been all these people. There's so many lawyer jokes in this play that I don't get, but they're there. So there's lots of layers of humor. There's lots of wit. There's lots of wordplay. So this is one that you could really watch over or read over. And if you like that kind of thing, there's characters. It's just wordplay constantly. So even though the plot is kind of simple, there's a lot going on wit and wisdom-wise. So that's my thoughts on the historical context. What I wanted to talk about the philosophy. Oh, and the other thing about the history of it is the men shutting themselves off from women that was Francis Bacon had experience of that because you're just around guys all the time. There's no, women are not allowed to be lawyers, obviously. So the men in the play being, just kind of lovesick and yearning for female companionship, that is probably something that all those men knew too well, just because of the nature of their vocation and how they could or couldn't socialize. So, or had time to socialize. So that, I guess, would have been very familiar to the people watching this play originally, and if we're going with Francis Bacon, which I am in all these videos, writing it would be very familiar with. And so I guess the other thing, just kind of going back to the shutting off of women as part of the pursuit of wisdom and what a folly that is that the greatest wisdom, as discussed in the play, is love, and love in action. So what are these guys doing that are just sitting in a library for 3 years? That's stagnant. And it's not, you can read something, but you can't know it or have the experience of it when you're just shut off from the world in that pursuit of wisdom. So it's not love just as romantic love, but love as a catalyst for action. Love as charity, love in action. That's where the wisdom is. And at the end of the play, that's what the women set the men to do. With Barone, use your wit and go make people happy. You're using your love. That's love in action. That's charity, and that's where it all flows. So without the women, without that feminine energy, there's no movement. And what's the point of, what is the point of that greater knowledge? So it's a little hard for me to put into words, but I think it's a really beautiful concept, and it's something that, has persisted throughout time. We still have people that want to shut themselves off or just read something or, get the theory of it, but it's really the practice of it. That's where the true wisdom comes in. And another thing that I thought was interesting is, why is this play called Love's Labour's Lost? And I think what I've heard is that in Masonry, truth was the lost word of God. So, and the word is wisdom, and the labor is the men in the beginning of the play. The labor of love is, there's no labor of love. They're not doing anything. So where it really comes into play is the labor of love in action, in performance, is kind of the regaining of that. It's not the loss of it. It's the regaining of it, or the using of that wisdom. So I thought that was really interesting. I wish I could articulate more on this, but it's basically tying back into the Revels. Is this play is all about balance. So there's chaos. It's not so crazy as some of the Shakespeare things that we've seen and we will see, but there is this imbalance. It's just masculine energy completely shutting off the feminine energy. And so that doesn't work. So by the end of the play, things come back into balance. And that is such a universal theme for anyone who is, a seeker, that it's bringing things into balance, coming into balance with yourself, with the world around you. That is just, an eternal lesson. So that's we see that in a lot of Shakespeare plays, but here it's so, it's such a noble pursuit in the beginning, but it's just gone about in not quite the smartest way. So before I talk about the versions to watch, I did want to read a passage because it's just really, really beautiful, and just hearing it outside of the play might be useful, and for me as well. So this is Barone, the one who had his doubts about this whole thing in the beginning. And he says, "But love, first learned in a lady's eyes, lives not alone immured in the brain, but with the motion of all elements courses as swift as thought in every power, and gives to every power a double power above their functions and their offices. It adds a precious seeing to the eye. A lover's eyes will gaze an eagle blind. A lover's ear will hear the lowest sound. When the suspicious head of theft is stopped, love's feeling is more soft and sensible than are the tender horns of cockled snails. Love's tongue proves dainty Bacchus gross in taste. For valor is not lover Hercules, still climbing trees in the Hesperides, subtle as Sphinx, as sweet and musical as bright Apollo's lute strung with his hair. And when love speaks, the voice of all the gods make heaven drowsy with the harmony." I'm going to read that again. "When love speaks, the voice of all the gods make heaven drowsy with the harmony." He goes on to say, "From women's eyes this doctrine I derive. They sparkle still the right Promethean fire. They are the books, the arts, the academes that show, contain, and nourish all the world." And then just a last line of this speech. "For charity," let's see. "Let us once lose our oaths to find ourselves, or else we lose ourselves to keep our oaths. It is religion to be thus forsworn, for charity itself fulfills the law, and who can sever love from charity?" So I think that's really beautiful. This play is all about love in action, and it's not just, it's a greater love than just, romantic comedy love. It is more universal, I think, than that. But yeah, it is love in action. It's not shutting off a whole kind of half of the energy we need to be whole. So those are my thoughts right now on this play. It is very deep, so I may keep studying this month and put up another video. We'll see. But I have one of my favorite versions to recommend. This is the Kenneth Branagh directed film of Love's Labour's Lost from the year 2000, and it's easily digitally rentable, or check your library to rent it on DVD. I'm sure it's widely available. So this is two of my favorite things, Shakespeare, and it's also set as a 1930s musical. So it is done wonderfully, where I think it adds and does not detract from the story. But just rewatching it, it made me so happy, and it's just very joyful. And for me, Kenneth Branagh, this has happened to me several times where I've started watching another version of a Shakespeare play and it just wasn't really making sense to me, and then I go and watch a Kenneth Branagh version and it makes perfect sense. The storytelling to me is so clear in one of his productions. So I hope you'll find that. It is a little abridged. It's only an hour and a half, so they've cut some things out, but nothing I could really tell was gone. So I think it's a fantastic thing to watch. If you really don't like 30s standards, I have another version to recommend, but this one I just think it is one of the things that when I was, I guess, a young teenager, one of the things that made me start to like Shakespeare, because I got it. I got the storytelling, and the things I didn't get, which I'm still learning now, years later, they're there, but I didn't feel like I was missing something because I got enough of the storytelling. Very funny, very light, but all the wisdom is pointed out, is done very well. So I really, really love that version. I hope you like it too. I've also have a Royal Shakespeare Company play version to recommend. That's from a few years ago. It's not Shakespeare's Globe, which I've recommended previously, and I was able to, you can rent it for £8. I was able to stream it, and that one it's good. It's the whole play. I don't prefer it as much, but it's very good. So I would actually recommend watching both. I would watch the Kenneth Branagh version, and then later in the month I would watch this Royal Shakespeare Company version and see what you get out of it, because a lot of things in this Royal Shakespeare Company version are done very well, also in a different way, which is very inventive. And it's really, once you love a play, it's so interesting to see different versions of it, because there's so many different things you can do, and you might love one thing from this version and one thing from that version, and they just teach you something completely different. So when we get to Macbeth, I don't even know what I'm going to be recommending, because there's so many great versions of that. So anyway, that's Love's Labour's Lost. If you stuck with me through this video, thank you, and I will see you next month for our next play. Happy May!